Thank you, Corla. And firstly, we also support this bill and the principle of it, though I'll have some questions as well. And I suppose my first response is, why is it taking so long? I was in the department when we did that early work around the voluntary code. And I know that from my experience at that time that there was, I suppose, a strong request from the voluntary housing sector, particularly the larger ones, that they should have a governance structure and that they should be regulated. Mainly because, first of all, it gave the public an assurance that they were properly run and properly managed. But secondly, I suppose as important to them was that it gave them a status in terms of raising funds, and that they would find it much easier to raise finance in order to borrow money in order to build social housing, along with the funding that they got from the state. And they really wanted to do that, particularly, as I say, the larger voluntary housing associations. And we did the earlier work on setting up the interim voluntary code, which was established in the housing agency. And it was mainly the larger ones, I think, that did sign up to the voluntary code at the time. You know, I do very much welcome the fact that we have now got to the point of introducing the legislation to set up a regulator. And largely, I think the way in which it's being done is the right way to do it. I mean, the contribution of the voluntary housing sector has been very strong, I think, particularly at a time when obviously the country didn't have an awful lot of money, which would have been my experience of their contribution. And there was a willingness on their part, I think, to very much to play their part in terms of providing housing and homes for people at that time when there wasn't as much public funding as there is now, at least I hope there is. So, you know, I think we should acknowledge that as well. But there clearly are different kinds of voluntary housing associations or approved housing bodies, and that's where the three tiers, I suppose, come from. And the history of the smaller ones was very much around a village or a town deciding to, you know, build houses for their older citizens in a lot of situations where they could retire into a safe environment. And the Voluntary Housing Association largely just managed those homes rather than building new ones. I think there's still probably a lot of those around the country. And then the much larger ones obviously had a lot more ambition. And some of the ones in the middle would have maybe sometimes focused on a particular category of the community in supplying housing for that particular category. So we have a real mix, I suppose, of within the sector. And I hope that we can treat them all fairly in the system that is being set up. And I suppose some of that will need to be teased out as the legislation moves on. And the Minister, in his opening contribution, did indicate that there would be government amendments, but I think largely technical from what he said. And certainly I think we would all want to ensure that we have the opportunity to table amendments where appropriate. I think one of the big problems is the whole issue of you know, accessing funding, and I support what's been said already in relation to the credit unions, and this is something that we've debated in the context of other housing bills and legislation, indeed I think under finance as well. But they really do need a special purpose vehicle, and anytime I've put in parliamentary questions, the answer that's come back every time was that, oh yes, the government will facilitate them setting up a special purpose vehicle, but they really need the government and the financial regulators, etc., to work with them, in central bank, etc., to work with them in relation to actually establishing a special purpose vehicle that they can feed into, because they have money. They are within all of our communities and they really can make a contribution, but they feel themselves, and we've all been lobbied by them, but they do feel that they haven't been assisted appropriately by government in terms of the establishment of such a vehicle. And I really think the willingness is there, and whether it's probably not your own department, Minister, that needs to do this, but we really do need to see a coming together of the credit union movement and government in terms of addressing that. I suppose the other big issue is the one about the government balance sheet, and I know, Minister English, I was at a presentation in one of the hotels here in Dublin where you were speaking it was about a year ago now, I think, where the sector had come together. I forget who ran the meeting, but it was around what can we do to address this issue of the voluntary housing sector being on the government balance sheet. And I don't know what progress you've made, and maybe in your response, again, strictly speaking, I suppose it's not the business of this legislation, but it is a huge factor in terms of the scale of the contribution that this sector can give to the housing crisis and to providing homes for people. And I don't know if you've made any progress in that regard, but I certainly would like to hear any update on it. With regard to the different sizes and different types of voluntary housing association, I'm trying to support what Deputy O'Brien has said around fees, and it's referred to, I think, in Section 11 and in Section 35. But I don't think there's an indication of the level of the fees in the legislation, and I presume that would be set at a later stage. But it really shouldn't be an obstacle. And, you know, I think Deputy O'Brien has made the point that if the fees are to cover costs, then they may be too high for the sector. And if they're not to cover costs, then, you know, what exactly are they achieving? So maybe, again, the Minister would give us his views on that. I know that one of the things that was going on over in the lead-up, I suppose, to this legislation was the issue of the number of voluntary housing associations that we have and the opportunity either to merge or to deregister. And again, I don't know what the up-to-date situation is on whether some have deregistered, whether some have merged. I know from my own personal experience, I happen to be on the board of a voluntary housing association that actually put itself out of existence and, you know, transferred assets, and because there were too many, and our perception as a board was that we actually didn't need to exist anymore, but so we transferred some elements of what we were doing to one of the larger voluntary housing associations, and at least one property to Dublin City Council at the time. This is going back a long time ago. You know, I do believe that maybe we have too many. And I don't know how much that discussion has gone on in the sector in this regard. And particularly some of the smaller ones, whether they need to continue in what they're doing or whether the local authority can take over some of their functions. Particularly, it's quite onerous for somebody to be on the board of any organisation because of your governance responsibilities. And in some cases, I think they have difficulty in actually getting people to take on that responsibility. So again, it's something that I think is important in the sector. I also agree with Deputy O'Brien around the issue of investigations in Section 47, and the wording is quite loose, and I would have thought that if there was to be an investigation, that it should be based on, you know, some criteria of concern around the way in which this particular voluntary housing association was operating, and that it shouldn't be just the opinion of the regulator, but that there should be some kind of concrete sort of reasons why an investigation would be instigated. I think that would be only fair to the associations concerned. So I think that's all that I wanted to say on the bill. My particular welcome is for the fact that it's actually happening, because it's been, I think, wanted for quite some time by the sector. I also would like to know if and when local authorities will be brought into this umbrella. I do realise that that will involve a lot of work and a lot of commitment on the state's part in terms of, I suppose, supporting the local authorities to actually bring themselves to the standards required. But certainly the tenants within local authority homes should not be at a lesser advantage than tenants of the voluntary housing sector, or indeed of the private sector. So if there is any update on that, I would be very interested in hearing it as well. Thank you.